are communalism and individualism, and how do they affect education? I'm Dr. Emily Sherwood. So today I'm going to talk about something that really affects education that some of you may not even heard of, and that's communalism and individualism. And these are two value systems that are opposite of each other. And I'm going to give examples of China and the United States. China is a very communalistic nation. Now, when people hear that, they think communist because China is technically still a communist government. I would argue that economically it's not communist and hasn't been for decades, but that's another story. It does have a government that's authoritarian, that does not have open and free elections and that sort of thing. A controlled party that's only a small percentage of the population. But that's not what communalism is necessarily. It doesn't have to be a communist country. It can occur in democracies, and there are other countries around the world, particularly many in Asia, that are some in Africa, that could be considered communalist. But China is by most methods the most communalist country in the world. And so what communalism is it means that the focus is on what's right for the state and for the society at large. So in Chinese society, traditionally they were very influenced by Confucius, who had ideas about the family and respect for elders, and there was a big emphasis on hierarchy. You know, who should you respect more? Who should you follow? A big emphasis on honor. And all of that kind of went into this individualism idea. China also has a very large population, and although there are still some very rural areas, and it is a very large country, most of the population lives in cities, and those cities are very crowded. So that has affected things also. Society is set up to accommodate large numbers of people in a way that in the United States and other Western countries, you don't have that issue. And China also is historically poor. It's no longer poor. It actually rivals the United States on some measures as far as well-being and poverty and so forth. But traditionally it was a poor country, and so that has influenced the culture at all. So it's a very communalistic society. That means that, again, family is important. Hierarchy is important, respect is important, and that shows up in the schools. So Chinese education is very focused on what the outcomes need to be for a good society, and for a society that is productive and that has harmony, that has morals. Chinese are very, very concerned all the time about safety. I don't know how many times when I lived in China somebody asked me, well, is the United States really unsafe? You know, they'll hear a story about gun violence or something, and they can't believe it. Because in China, the main focus and the main goal is a safe and peaceful society. A society without a lot of drama, a society that is, prosperous, but also does it change a lot? A society that is able to sustain itself without a lot of conflict, without a lot of interference from others, and that's the whole idea, was to keep the society safe rather than to protect the rights of individuals. So rights are really not a big thing in China. The whole idea is what's good for society at large. And if that means interfering with someone's rights, one or two people, inconveniencing them, even making their lives hard in a way that's not fair, then the population for the most part will approve of that. And that's something that's hard for Westerners to understand. But again, the goal is this peaceful, prosperous, good society at large. And so in education, you see this principle really, really strongly. So in China, their education is severely structured, especially in the public schools. And so there will be 35 to 40 students in a class, sometimes even more in some of the cities. And it's based on a lot of recitation, a lot of memorization, and there's not a lot of creativity, and there's not a lot of individual expression. In fact, if you talk to a Chinese person just in general, sometimes they even have problems talking about themselves, because again, you're supposed to think of yourself as a member of a family and a society, not just your issues. So everything's super structured, everything is based on authority, there's huge respect for teachers, and students are pretty much expected to learn the same way as everyone else. There's no differentiation, so to speak, and it's a shame-based discipline system. So there's not a lot of discipline problems, but if they do occur, they're dealt with very quickly, and that child will face shame at home because that child should not have disrespected their teacher, because again, there's this hierarchy of who to respect in society to keep society functioning in a way that works for people and that works for the future. It's very future oriented. So because of that, the good things are that there are a few discipline problems at school. You don't see a lot of what you see in the United States as far as, behavior problems and parents having problems with teachers. That's pretty much unheard of. A parent might have a question or want to know something, how to better their child's education. That happens. But this questioning of teachers and testing of the curriculum, it is not a thing in most of China, especially in public schools. It just doesn't happen. Comunalism is also very good for science and technology, and you see that reflects in test scores. At the private school I taught with, most of the students were from public schools. And even the ones who were struggling, who were not considered the best students, were miles ahead in math, especially math. Because math, again, is memorization, and there's a logic and an order. And so when you look at China and its economy, and how in the last 30 years it has totally blown up, and they have a really good economy now. A lot of that was technology and innovation, technical innovation, and I don't think that would have happened without math and science being prioritized in schools. So those are the benefits, and the negatives of this are that there's not a lot of creativity. Students do not have a lot of skills when it comes to critical thinking or something like essay writing. That's not really, a lot of them don't know how to do that. And the humanities is not as big a thing as it is in the United States. There are still, lots of artists and opera singers and things in China. But traditionally, the arts in the schools are not emphasized. The big problem with communalism in education is that it doesn't work for everyone. The education system was not designed to meet individual needs, and there's a certain segment of students that they can't do that. These students need extra support, or they may need to do things in a different way. They may need to learn in a different way. They may want to do something like become an artist or a musician, and the schools won't support that because, again, thinking about society at large, that's not something that really is valued as much as in the United States. Like I said, they still have these things. And so because of that, almost half of students in China, and in some places more than half, I would say that in some of the big cities, it's much more than half, will go to private schools. The parents will decide that this system is too strict. It's too astute for students. There's too much structure. It's too hard on them. You hear a lot about student mental health being bad in China, and this is part of it because, again, students have to sit in rows. They memorize things every day, and they're expected to do well. But again, they're expected to do well in this really rigid way, and that's not human nature. Humans are different. They have different needs. They have different desires and different ways that they want to learn. The other group that really struggles in China are students with disabilities, and the official research shows that between 90 and 95% of students with disabilities go to school. However, I doubt that after living in China and hearing some of the stories. I love China. I miss it all the time. Because there were some really positives to being there. But it's very common for students with disabilities not to go to school. And anytime that you have any kind of data from the Chinese government, it may not be the most accurate because of the way things are measured. It's a very opaque government. There's not a lot of transparency. So that statistic to me is not. I would be very surprised if that was true. That may be true in a small portion of the country that they studied. I don't know. I don't know. And again, it's very hard to get measurements from China or how they got the results they did, especially in English. But according to government statistics, only 50% of students are in regular schools that have disabilities. And the only thing that is considered disabled in China are physical disabilities. So students who can't see, who can't hear, who have trouble walking maybe. Something happened and they have trouble with that. Disabilities that you can see for the most part. We all know, at least those of us who work with students, that there are many disabilities that cannot be seen right away. And those are actually, as far as organically found in nature, based on medical research, those are much more common, especially today. When we do have medical access to medicine and surgeries and things that help students. So if the student has something going on mentally, in other words, if the student has trouble learning, or the student may have some kind of intellectual delay, the student may just struggle to learn in more than one way, or the student may have something with mental health, autism, anything like that. Generally, that's still not considered a disability, which is an astounding thing for me to say in 2025. But schools do not consider that a disability that warrants other services. That's starting to change, particularly in the big cities. But in most cases, those students will just go to school and they'll just sit. And they may learn something, but they may lack basic skills because they don't have the support to help them. And if those students show discipline problems, which can happen, particularly with students who are frustrated because maybe they are having a hard time learning, or they have something, the stimulation in the room is too much or whatever. If those students act out, they may leave school, or they may go to a private school where they may or may not get a good education, because private schools, there's a large variety of private schools in China, which is a whole other thing. And the students who are diagnosed with having disabilities generally do not go to high school. That means they go up to school till about age 15 and they leave. It's almost unheard of for a student with a disability to go to college or to have a good career. These people usually live at home with their families and are taken care of. And there's not a lot of extra support like what we would think of, like speech therapy, occupational therapy. Those things aren't really found in schools. Again, this is beginning to change, particularly in the southeast where I was. There's starting to be some programs for students, some nonprofits that work with students, some schools that have extra things, extra support. I know that there was a band program for students with disabilities where I lived, because our school was doing a program to fundraise with them. There's starting to be things, but it's very, very, it's probably more like 60 years behind the United States. It's very primitive services for students with disabilities, and those really just started in the last about 15 years. So that's the big negative, is that all students can't succeed with comunalism. They can't. There's a lot of students who need things that are not found in these schools. And that's the big issue. Now, going on to individualism. Individualism is the idea of the rights of the individual, the rights of the person. And in the West, especially in the United States is considered the most individualistic country in the world. Much more so than places in Europe, which are still individualistic, but they have a little bit of communalism tendencies. The United States is the most individualistic country in the world. And in the United States, most of the value systems are based on Western tradition, like Greek and Roman tradition, or they're based on what we might call Judeo-Christian tradition. And the Judeo-Christian tradition is largely individualistic. It talks about what a person should do individually rather than communally, for the most part. And individualism, especially from the Greek and the Roman cultures, is also very hedonistic. What that means is there was a focus on feeling good and comfort and doing what you wanted to do, and not thinking about things like sacrifice or far into the future, which is a communalist idea. So how does this transfer to education? So the good news is, the strengths of this are that the United States educates everyone. because there's this idea that individuals have rights on their own, no matter what's going on with that student. That's a tenet of education. And the United States, for the most part, does more for individual students who have different needs that don't necessarily fit inside the norm than almost every other country in the world. There are some exceptions, especially when it comes to physical disabilities. Some places in Europe are better, but for the most part, the United States offers a lot more to students who need extra support or extra help for different reasons. We have programs for students with disabilities, migrant education, homeless education. We ensure that, at least in theory, that students who are homeless have the right to an education. There are programs for poor students, there are programs for English learners. There are lots of different programs. And that's based on this ideal, and it is very much an ideal because, again, it's not perfect and that there's still a lot of need, but there's the idea that all children should have the right to an education, and that's what it's founded on. And that's the huge strength of this country. Individualism also offers a lot of things like creativity. We have a lot of arts programs, music programs, programs for students who have different interests. There are lots of sports clubs. There are clubs for interest, arts clubs, many different things. We honor students' religious preference in school for the most part, as much as is appropriate. For example, if a student doesn't can't eat a particular food because of religion, or the food has to be cooked a certain way, the cafeteria will ensure that child has a meal that is appropriate for that child's culture and religious beliefs. And most countries around the world will not do that. Students have the right to practice religion in some form in schools, generally after school, before school. There are religious clubs, which many countries don't allow. So there are a lot of strengths with this. And the idea of equality and students being able to express themselves freely, it is very strong, at least in theory, in U.S. schools. The downside of this is that individualism and the focus on rights in the United States has kind of taken a turn that is so extreme that it's caused problems. So, for example, sometimes students feel really entitled in U.S. schools. They feel like they should be able to do what they want to do. So there are lots of stories, especially in some of the more affluent schools, but all over the country, where parents will argue with teachers about students' grades because they feel like the child did a good job, and there's this idea that the child shouldn't have to work super hard to earn a good grade. That's just an example of some things that happen. There's the idea that teachers should do a lot of things for the students, again, out of this idea of the student being comfortable, that the student should be able to do what the student wants to do, that the student should have every right to do what the student wants. Students should be able to go to the bathroom at any time. That's a big controversy, believe it or not, in the United States, of when students should be able to go to the bathroom, because there's this idea that students should be comfortable. And so, if you need to use the restroom, a lot of people believe that the students should be able to go at any time. But that makes it really hard for the teacher, because the teacher's trying to teach and she's got students going in and out, or he has students going in and out all the time. There's this idea in a lot of schools about snacks. There's this huge controversy, especially in elementary school, because parents want their children to be able to eat snacks in the classroom. And sometimes that's just not a good thing, because there's pest control, there's a lot of trash on the floor. It doesn't always work that way. There's just a lot of things like this that people believe that they should have rights and not have to do a lot. And the attitudes of students often is, I don't want to do something that's hard and I shouldn't have to. And we're seeing more and more of that in schools. An idea that's kind of related to that is truancy. Many students just won't go to school anymore. The rates of truancy are super high. Here in South Carolina, 25% of students are chronically absent. They miss a lot of school for reasons that are not necessarily because of health or family issues. They just don't want to come to school. And there's this idea in some families in the United States that that's acceptable because of a child's mental health, that the child shouldn't have to go to school because school may make them anxious. Again, this hedonistic idea that you don't need to sacrifice in life. that life is should be very comfortable and very easy. And as there are legitimate mental health concerns in this country, and there are very legitimate health concerns in this country and all around the world, this idea is becoming more and more prevalent. Whereas when I was in school, I'm 42, I'll be 43 in May. When I was in school, that was not something that was considered normal. But we're becoming more and more individualistic and more hedonistic as a culture. There's also this idea related to discipline, that students have a lot of rights. So if a student is disrespectful to a teacher, many times the parent will come back and say, well, you know, the teacher did this. The teacher shouldn't have done this because it's my student's right to have a good teacher, to have, to be treated a certain way. And there's a big rights issue when it comes to disabled students in particular. Now, I'm going to say, and I'll say this on every video that I do with when talking about special education students, that this is not the majority of special education students. Most special education students are well behaved, kind. I've worked with some really great students who are enrolled in special education. But more and more, there are students who have significant needs, such as socio-emotional needs that make it hard to be in a classroom. For example, the student may elope. That means the student might leave. Or the student might hit another student or the teacher. And because we are such a rights-driven nation, and there are so many rights in place for students who have disabilities, it becomes sometimes hard to discipline those students. If the problem is because of the student's disability, it's very difficult to find a solution for that student. And this will not be a big problem, except that there's not enough funding for appropriate solutions. There's not enough funding for that because special education was never fully funded in the United States. So all of that's leading to kind of this teacher shortage. That's part of the problem with the teacher shortage. Part of the problem why students are not enrolled or leaving public school. A lot of students are becoming homeschooled, or they're going to private schools, and a lot of that's a discipline part of things. Because again, parents expect their child to be entitled, and sometimes there are even laws that allow for that. And that's not appropriate. But again, we're so focused on rights in this country, specifically rights for people who may have special needs or special situations, that it becomes very difficult to deal with these problems in a way that's appropriate for the majority of the class, which would be the communalist viewpoint, thinking about the majority of the class or the teacher rather than, just one student. And that's becoming a big issue in schools. Kind of on a really serious note, American schools have faced a lot of security threats in the last few years. There's been a lot of high-profile mass shootings. Fortunately, that's still a pretty rare thing. Most students will not have to go through that, thankfully. But the whole idea that the students have to suffer because there are mass shootings in this country. We have to have lockdown drills. We have to have we have to practice what happens if there's a shooter on campus. And sometimes there are relatively minor things that happen and the school has to shut down or keep kids within the building, which is called a modified lockdown. And that's because of the national view of rights, which includes the right to have guns in this country. And that is absolutely astounding to me, that this country could care more about the so-called rights to cause harm than the well-being of children. And I guess that's a political statement, but that's how I feel about it. So that's a huge problem. And for those of you who may be thinking, oh, well, how can China, not accept children with disabilities? How can they not see that children need things? That's a problem. But if you think of it from another cultural viewpoint, the Chinese cannot imagine how the U.S. would allow schools to be unsafe places for students, for teachers, with the amount of what you might call low-level violence, like hitting, or even emotional violence, like screaming, being very disrespectful, how schools can allow that. And then, of course, the most serious extreme of this problem is something like a school shooting, which causes, incredible mental and physical harm. So, so both extremes have their issues, for sure. So, I hope you found this interesting. If you did, please like and subscribe. And thank you so much, and keep learning.